Friends, I welcome you to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It is not difficult for you, but it is pleasant for me. And we're starting. All the characters in the story who enter into intimate relationships are over 18 years old. David looked around the small, dimly lit waiting room. There were several strange magazines, mostly women's magazines, scattered on the low table next to the chair in which he was sitting. Soft sounds of classical music poured from a speaker mounted on a shelf above his head. The melody was loud enough to drown out the low murmur of voices that reached David's ears through the wall, but not so much as to be annoying. Finally, the door opened and she walked in. Susan looked at him and smiled weakly, uncertainly, when he turned his head and his gaze turned to her face. However, David immediately looked away, not even trying to talk to her. Despite the fact that there were 6 chairs in the room, Susan sat down on the one next to him. "Thank you for coming, David," she said. "I hope Dr. Marks can help us move on." David did not react to her words, silently frozen in his chair. He just looked into her eyes, and she could tell from his cold gaze that he didn't believe her. Just as she was about to start apologizing, once again the inner door to the next room opened, and a tearful woman came out, wiping her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief. Lowering her head, the woman hurriedly crossed the room and disappeared through the door of the reception room. A few moments later, a short, plump woman appeared from the same inner door and walked towards them. She had short hair and a not very expressive face, which could tell that she hardly used makeup. The brown sweater outlined the lady's sagging waist and could not hide her bulging tummy. She was wearing an outdated green skirt that went down to mid-calf, and simple and unremarkable brown flat shoes did not compensate at all, but rather emphasized her short stature. "Mr. and Mrs. Stillwell? What is it?" she asked half-assuredly, then immediately continued. "I'm Fran Marks. Thank you for coming today. Please come into my office." Without waiting for a response, Dr. Marks turned around on the spot and marched back to her professional abode. Susan followed her, and David, very reluctantly getting out of his chair, followed his wife. When everyone was seated, Dr. Marks, who had taken her place at the massive table, put her elbows in front of her, laced her fingers into a lock and spoke. "So, as I understand it, the court ordered you to consult because Susan's lawyer demanded it after David filed for divorce. Have I described the situation correctly? What is it?" she asked, shifting her gaze from one to the other. David and Susan nodded almost simultaneously, and then Susan leaned forward and blurted out, "I hope that you can convince David to give up the divorce and return home to me and the children." Dr. Marks nodded gravely and turned her head to her husband. "And you, David, why are you here today?" David looked up wearily at the doctor sitting across from him. "I'm here because the judge said I should be here." "Well, today we are gathered for the first time, and we will see each other here for another 11 sessions. I hope we can resolve some of the problems that have arisen between you and allow you to move forward and live in harmony." David didn't say anything to this. He just continued to stare at the doctor with a completely blank look, if not through her. Fran Marks sighed softly and continued, turning her attention back to her wife. "Okay, Susan, why don't you tell me why you came here?" "As I said," she said eagerly, "I want David to end this stupid divorce and come home. I don't want a divorce. His parents, my parents, our children and our friends all agree that he should end this stupid divorce and return to his family, to our house." "David," the consultant turned to her husband, "it seems that literally everyone who knows you believes that you should not divorce your wife. Tell me, what made you file for divorce?" "She said she doesn't love me anymore. And I can't be married to a woman who doesn't love me," he said softly but firmly. Susan snorted loudly from her seat. "That's not true. I never said that I didn't love him. Moreover, I told him many times that I loved him." "David, if Susan says she still loves you, why don't you believe her?" the doctor asked. David glanced at Susan with obvious disgust and then turned to the doctor. "Actions speak louder than words," he said shortly. "But I didn't do anything," Susan wailed, on the verge of tears. David crossed his arms over his chest. "Bye," he stated even more briefly, narrowing his eyes. Fran raised her eyebrows in disbelief. "I need you to explain this to me, David." He raised his left wrist a little closer to his face and looked at his Apple wristwatch. With the index finger of his right hand, he, specifically for bestweapon.in, he tapped them emphatically several times, and then spoke. That was 5 weeks ago, on a Friday evening. I came home from work and he jerked his chin in the direction of his wife Dash, was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and waiting for me. It took me about 20 seconds to realize that something was wrong. She said we needed to talk and asked me to sit at her table. I poured myself a small portion and sat down opposite her. Then she informed me that she had already agreed to a date with another man and was going to go out with him the next evening. Not only that, she also said that if the Saturday date goes well and she likes everything, then maybe she won't come home until the middle of Sunday. So, Dr. Marks, this is the news that was waiting for me at home on Friday evening. Okay, maybe I'm not the sharpest knife in the world, but even I could figure out what that meant. At that moment, I realized that if my wife is planning to spend the night with another man, it means that she no longer loves me. Susan whined again. But I didn't do anything. I didn't go on a date and I didn't sleep with anyone. And you? You left me and filed for divorce, even though I didn't do anything. How many times do I have to repeat this? Is that true, David? The consultant intervened. Susan says she didn't go on a date and didn't cheat on you. If this is true, then why did you file for divorce? Intention, David said laconically, holding up his finger. Dr. Marks looked puzzled. Intention? David nodded at her. That's exactly the intention. She intended to make love to some guy and expected me to let her do it. After I packed up and left, she now claims that she canceled the date and spent the whole weekend trying to find me. Do you have any reason to believe that this is not true? Dr. Marks raised her eyebrows. I don't know. However, it doesn't matter. All I know is that she definitely intended to sleep with some guy because I'm not enough for her anymore. I never said that. Susan screamed. And you didn't have to say it verbally. Your intention screamed it right in my face, humiliating me, David retorted. Dr. Marks tried to stop the altercation and regain control of the situation. David, I understand why you were upset by Susan's proposal, but she really didn't do it. When she saw that you didn't approve of it, she refused the date. Of course, your wife deserves credit for that. David pursed his lips and shook his head. And in my opinion, it's like saying that I deserve credit for not robbing the bank next door. He paused significantly, but it was noticeable that Dr. Marks was still confused by the misunderstanding. So David developed his idea. Look, if I planned a robbery, prepared an escape car, bought a mask, wrote an ultimatum note for the cashier and handed it to her, then I suppose this indicates my clear intention to rob the bank. Then, after reading the note, the cashier just tells me no, and I run away from there. But no matter how you look at it, I'm still guilty of trying to rob a bank. Dr. Marks leaned back in her chair, and understanding showed on her frowning face. She turned to Susan and then looked back at David. Slowly shaking her head, the consultant spoke. I have been doing this for 17 years and have heard similar arguments many times. Until today, every time I tried to protect my spouse, who retreated from his plans of infidelity because, in the end, he remained faithful to the marriage. Right now I'm trying my best to find flaws in your reasoning, David, but I am not a lawyer. But I know that the intention to rob a bank is in itself a criminal offense, even if you did not manage to get a cent of the bank's money. David nodded at Dr. Marks, pleased that she could now understand the reason why he had filed for divorce. WHWH, what's going on? Susan stammered, looking worried, looking from her husband to the doctor. What does the bank robbery have to do with our problem? Fran raised her hand to David. Please explain it to her. Susan, you took the time to get to know your new friend better. You've probably had lunch together a few times, perhaps more than a few. You developed an interest in him, which eventually turned into an intimate one. This interest prompted you to agree to a date with him. When you agreed to a date, you were well aware of what his further intentions were. You're a big girl now, and you know what's what, don't you? At the same time, you were so sure of your friend's intentions that you felt it necessary to inform me about the upcoming date, as well as that you would most likely stay with him overnight. Thus, you once again confirmed your intention to follow his plans. In other words, you confirmed your intention to make love to another man. The fact that you canceled the date after my objections does not change your previous aspirations in any way. I believe that if you loved me the way I love you, you would never agree to a date with another man. But alas, you agreed to this date, which means that you can't love me the way I love you. I loved you. I'm sorry, Susan, but I can't be married to someone who doesn't love me enough to stay away from men with similar intentions. Susan lowered her head and sobbed. When David got up from his seat, Dr. Marks also stood up and extended her hand to him. Thank you for coming today. I will inform the judge that there is no need for additional sessions for you. Then she turned to Susan, who was still sobbing, and put her hand on her shoulder. But I suppose I'll have to spend some more time with your wife.